The royal decree had been explicit. No Omega bearing a forbidden bloodline could enter the capital, and Essie Whitlam had broken that law the moment she crossed the stone bridge at dawn. The toddler tucked against her ribs breathed in stuttered gasps, tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her cloak as the scent of rogue wolves thickened in the air. She could feel them circling, shadows moving between the market stalls, their eyes tracking the flutter of her heartbeat like predators sensing wounded prey. Pack law demanded she surrender the child. Blood oath or not, the council had made their position clear 3 months ago when they dragged her before the High Court and stripped her of her name. But the little girl hidden beneath the wool, Nellie, with her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's doomed legacy, represented something far more dangerous than a broken vow. She was the heir to the throne that 2 kingdoms had gone to war over, and Essie would die before she let the rogues claim her. The Alpha tracked her tears before he tracked her scent. Clarence Dunstan had always possessed that unnerving ability, the way he could taste grief in the air like copper on his tongue, the way he knew when someone was breaking apart even from miles away. He'd been standing in the war room when the bond snapped taut in his chest, pulling him north with such violence he'd knocked over 3 generals and a tactical map spanning centuries of bloodshed. His beta had grabbed his arm, warned him about rushing into the borderlands without backup, but Clarence was already shifting, already running, because that particular flavor of desperation could only mean one thing. Essie was in danger. And she had the child with her. Tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because this story is about to break your heart in ways you won't see coming. The marketplace erupted into chaos as the first rogue struck. He came from the left, a massive brute with scars cross-hatching his muzzle, and Essie barely managed to dodge, her boots slipping on the cobblestones as she threw herself sideways. Nellie whimpered, and Essie pressed her hand over the toddler's mouth, her own breath coming in ragged pants. She couldn't shift, not with Nellie in her arms, not without exposing the child to teeth and claws and the brutal efficiency of pack violence. So she ran. Behind her, the rogue snarled something about the forbidden bloodline, about coin and bounties and what the southern packs would pay for an Omega stupid enough to defy the council's judgment. His companion laughed, a wet, ugly sound that promised pain, and Essie felt her wolf surge against her skin, begging for release, begging to fight. But fighting meant dropping Nellie. Fighting meant risking everything she'd sacrificed to keep this child alive. The forbidden bloodline traced back 3 generations, to a time when pack law still acknowledged Omega sovereignty, when an Omega queen could rule without an alpha at her side. Essie's grandmother had been that queen, Mavis Whitlam, who'd united 7 packs under a single banner and refused every alpha who'd tried to claim her throne through marriage. She'd rewritten the blood oath to protect Omegas from forced bonding, had created sanctuaries where wolves could exist outside the brutal hierarchy that demanded submission or death. And for that, she'd been assassinated in her sleep, her throat torn out by her own council, her reforms burned to ash before sunrise. Nellie was Mavis's great-granddaughter, the last living heir to a throne that no longer existed, carried in secret by an Omega who'd sworn a blood oath to protect her even as the world conspired to erase her from existence. Essie turned down an alley, her lungs burning, Nellie's weight solid and warm against her chest. The rogues followed, their footsteps echoing off the narrow walls, and she realized with sick certainty that she'd made a tactical error. The alley dead ended in a brick wall too high to climb, too solid to break through, and the rogues were already blocking her escape route, their grins wide and satisfied. "Nowhere left to run, little Omega," the scarred one said, rolling his shoulders. "Hand over the whelp and we'll make this quick. Keep fighting and we'll take our time." Essie's hand moved to the knife at her hip, a pitiful defense against 2 full-grown rogues, but she'd learned long ago that survival wasn't about winning. It was about making them regret ever hunting you in the first place. She pulled the blade free, felt its familiar weight settle in her palm, and bared her teeth in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You want her," Essie said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Come take her." The rogue lunged, and Essie moved on instinct, slashing upward in an arc that caught him across the forearm. Blood sprayed, hot and copper-bright, and he howled, stumbling back. His companion moved faster, trying to flank her, and Essie spun, keeping her body between the rogues and Nellie, her knife hand never wavering. She'd trained for this scenario 1,000 times in the 3 months since fleeing the capital. Had practiced fighting with one arm incapacitated, with her vision obscured, with every disadvantage imaginable. But training and reality were different beasts, and reality had teeth. The second rogue caught her wrist, twisting hard enough to make her cry out, hard enough to make her fingers spasm and release the knife. It clattered to the ground, useless, and Essie threw her weight backward, slamming into the wall with Nellie sandwiched safely between her body and the brick. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, but she didn't let go, didn't surrender, didn't stop fighting even as the rogue's claws extended, even as he reached for her throat. And then the Alpha arrived. Clarence hit the rogue like a freight train, his shifted form massive and midnight black, his jaws closing around the rogue's shoulder with enough force to shatter bone. The rogue screamed, a high, animal sound, and then Clarence was tearing him away from Essie, throwing him against the opposite wall with casual brutality. The scarred rogue tried to flee, tried to scramble toward the alley's entrance, but Clarence was faster, his teeth finding the back of the rogue's neck, his growl vibrating through the narrow space like thunder. It was over in seconds. 2 rogues lay broken on the cobblestones, their blood pooling in the gaps between stones, and Clarence shifted back to human form, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Essie's face. She was shaking, her cloak soaked through with sweat and fear, and Nellie was crying now, soft hiccuping sobs that shredded what remained of Essie's composure. "You shouldn't be here," Clarence said, his voice rough. "The council issued a warrant for your arrest 2 weeks ago. If they find you—" "They won't," Essie interrupted, adjusting her grip on Nellie. "I'm leaving the kingdom tonight. I just needed supplies." Clarence took a step closer, and Essie flinched despite herself, despite knowing he'd never hurt her, despite the bond between them that had existed since childhood. He stopped immediately, his hands raised in surrender, his expression cracking into something raw and painful. "Essie," he said, "please, let me help you." "You can't help me," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "You're the Alpha. You're bound by pack law. If you help me, they'll strip you of your title. They'll execute you for treason. I don't care." "I do." Essie stepped around him, moving toward the alley's entrance, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "I care, Clarence. Which is why you need to let me go." But Clarence didn't move aside. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek, catching the tears she hadn't realized were falling. His thumb traced the path of her grief, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every unsaid truth between them. "I tracked your tears," he said. "Across 3 territories, through wards that should have hidden you, past barriers designed to keep alphas out. I tracked your tears because the bond won't let me do anything else. Because even when you're breaking pack law, even when you're risking execution, even when you're carrying another man's child, I can't stop protecting you." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and devastating, and Essie felt something inside her chest crack wide open. Nellie wasn't another man's child. Nellie was Essie's blood, her cousin's daughter, orphaned when the council had burned down the sanctuary where Essie's family had been hiding. But explaining that meant explaining everything. The forbidden bloodline, the heir to the throne, the blood oath that had turned Essie from a decorated pack healer into a fugitive wanted in 7 kingdoms. "She's not," Essie started, but Clarence shook his head. "I know whose child she is," he said quietly. "I've always known, Essie. Did you really think you could hide something like that from me?" The public betrayal happened in the council chamber 3 months earlier, though Essie was only now understanding its full scope. She'd been summoned to testify about the sanctuary raids, about the Omegas who'd died defending children who carried bloodlines the council deemed too dangerous to preserve. She'd stood before the High Court and told them the truth, that pack law had failed, that the hierarchy built on dominance and submission had created a system where power mattered more than mercy, where tradition justified atrocity. And Clarence, standing among the council members in his formal alpha regalia, had said nothing. He'd watched her testify, watched her plead for reform, watched her beg them to spare the surviving children. And when the council had voted unanimously to declare her testimony treasonous, to strip her of her pack affiliation, to issue a warrant for her arrest, Clarence had remained silent. She'd felt the bond between them strain that day, felt it stretch thin as spider silk, and she'd wondered if it would snap entirely. Maybe that would be a mercy. But it hadn't snapped, and that was the cruelest joke of all, that she was bound to an alpha who'd chosen his title over her life, who'd stood by while the council destroyed everything she'd fought to protect. "You knew," Essie whispered, pulling away from his touch. "You knew what Nellie represented, and you said nothing. You let them issue the warrant. You let them hunt me." "I was trying to buy you time," Clarence said, his voice strained. "If I'd spoken against the council, they would have moved immediately. By staying silent, I convinced them I was loyal, that I wouldn't interfere. Gave you 3 months to run, Essie. 3 months to hide her. 3 months of living like an animal." Essie spat, her composure finally shattering. 3 months of watching over my shoulder, of stealing food, of sleeping in abandoned buildings because I couldn't risk anyone recognizing me. 3 months of Nellie asking where her mother is, why we can't go home, why the bad men are chasing us. You call that protection?" Clarence flinched, and Essie felt a savage satisfaction at his pain, at proof that she could still hurt him the way he'd hurt her. But the satisfaction was short-lived, buried under the exhaustion that had been building since the sanctuary burned, since she'd pulled Nellie from the rubble and sworn a blood oath to keep her alive no matter the cost. "I call it survival," Clarence said finally. "Which is more than the council would have given you." Nellie shifted in Essie's arms, her small voice muffled against the cloak. "Essie, I'm scared." "I know, sweetheart," Essie murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of Nellie's head. "We're leaving now. We're going somewhere safe." "There is nowhere safe," Clarence said, and the resignation in his tone made Essie's stomach drop. "The southern packs have doubled the bounty on your head. The rogues aren't working alone anymore. They're coordinated, funded, organized. Someone powerful wants Nellie dead, and they won't stop hunting until they succeed. Then I'll keep running. Until when? Until they corner you in another alley. Until Nellie's old enough to understand that her entire existence is illegal." Clarence stepped closer, and this time Essie didn't flinch, didn't retreat, because there was nowhere left to go. "You can't do this alone, Essie. You need help. You need an alpha willing to defy the council. And you think that's you?" Essie laughed, bitter and broken. "You already chose your side, Clarence. You chose the council. You chose pack law over everything we—" She cut herself off, the words too dangerous to speak aloud, the truth too painful to acknowledge. But Clarence heard them anyway. He always did. "Over everything we had," he finished softly. "Over the bond. Over you. You're right. I made that choice 3 months ago, and it's been killing me every day since." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded piece of parchment, and pressed it into her free hand. "But I'm making a different choice now." Essie unfolded the parchment with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the formal script, the official seal stamped at the bottom. It took her a moment to process what she was reading, and when she did, her breath caught in her throat. It was a formal challenge to the council's authority. A declaration that Clarence Dunstan, Alpha of the Northern Territory, was invoking ancient pack law to demand a tribunal. That he was officially claiming Essie Whitlam as his mate under the old codes, the ones that predated the council's reforms, the ones that granted alphas the right to protect their omegas against any threat, including the pack itself. "You can't," Essie breathed. "Clarence, if you submit this, they'll have to honor it," Clarence interrupted. "The old codes are still legally binding. They can't refuse a tribunal without delegitimizing their own authority. And during the tribunal, you and Nellie will be under my protection. Untouchable. And after the tribunal, when they rule against you, when they execute you for treason and me for defying the warrant." Essie shook her head, shoving the parchment back at him. "I won't let you die for me. Then what's the alternative? Clarence demanded, his control finally cracking, his voice rising. I watch you run until the rogues catch you. I wait for news that they found your body in a ditch somewhere, that Nellie was sold to the highest bidder. That's not protection, Essie. That's cowardice. It's survival, Essie shot back. Which is more than you ever taught me to value. The words were meant to wound, and they did. Clarence recoiled as if she'd struck him, his expression shuddering, and Essie felt the bond between them constrict, felt it pull taut with pain. She wanted to take it back, wanted to apologize, but the damage was done, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe if the bond broke entirely, she could finally stop hoping he'd choose her. Stop believing that love could triumph over duty. But before either of them could speak, Nellie's small hand emerged from beneath the cloak, reaching toward Clarence with a fearless trust only children possessed. Alpha, she said, her voice tiny and uncertain. Are you Essie's friend? Clarence's expression softened, and he crouched down, bringing himself to Nellie's eye level. I'm trying to be, he said gently. Are you okay, little one? Are you hurt? Nellie shook her head, her storm-gray eyes, so much like her mother's, so much like Mavis Whitlam's, studying his face with solemn intensity. Essie says the bad men want to take me away. She says I have to be very quiet and very brave. Essie's right, Clarence said. But I'm not going to let the bad men take you. I promise. Promises are easy to break, Essie said coldly, pulling Nellie back against her chest. Especially for alphas. Clarence stood slowly, and when he looked at Essie, his eyes carried the weight of every failure between them, every moment he'd chosen duty over devotion. I know, he said. Which is why I'm going to prove this one is different. He turned and walked to the alley's entrance, and Essie thought he was leaving, thought she'd finally driven him away. But instead he shifted, his body expanding into the massive black wolf that had haunted her dreams for 3 months, and positioned himself at the mouth of the alley, guarding them, protecting them from whatever came next. And despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the warrant, despite the council's judgment, Essie felt the bond between them pulse with something that might have been hope. The escalation began at midnight, when the council mobilized every available enforcer in the kingdom. News of Clarence's tribunal challenge had spread through the territories like wildfire, and the High Court had responded with unprecedented aggression. They declared Essie's crimes elevated from treason to blood crimes, which carried a mandatory death sentence. They issued orders to kill on sight, no trial required, no mercy granted. And they sent their best hunters, wolves who'd trained their entire lives to track and eliminate threats to pack stability, into the borderlands with a single objective: bring back Clarence Dunstan in chains, and bring back the Omega and child in body bags. Essie learned about the escalation from Clarence's beta, a stern woman named Thora Calwell who appeared in the abandoned warehouse where they'd taken shelter with grim news and even grimmer supplies. She'd brought weapons, provisions, false identification papers, and a warning that made Essie's blood run cold. They're not playing by the rules anymore, Thora said, checking the silver-loaded crossbow she'd strapped to her back. The councils declared martial law in the Northern Territories. Anyone caught aiding you will be executed alongside their entire family line. They're serious about making an example of this, Essie. They want every Omega in the kingdom to know what happens when you defy pack law. How long before they reach us? Clarence asked, his voice calm despite the tension radiating from his frame. 6 hours, Thora replied. Maybe less if they pick up your scent trail. The head enforcer is leading the hunt personally. Quillan Malloy, the one who executed the sanctuary healers last summer. He's not interested in capturing you alive. Essie had heard of Quillan Malloy. Every wolf in the kingdom had. He was the council's attack dog, the enforcer who'd made his reputation by eliminating entire bloodlines deemed problematic. He was efficient, merciless, and utterly loyal to the hierarchy that had elevated him from rogue to decorated killer. If Quillan was hunting them, their chances of survival had just dropped from slim to non-existent. We need to move, Essie said, already gathering their meager supplies. If we can reach the western border before dawn. The western border is blocked, Thora interrupted. They've stationed enforcers at every crossing point. The eastern border too. North takes you into rogue territory, and south leads straight to the capital. You're surrounded, Essie. The only way out is through them. Clarence stood abruptly, his presence filling the warehouse with barely contained violence. Then we fight. Against 50 enforcers. Thora shook her head. That's suicide, Alpha. Even for you. I'm not letting them take her, Clarence said, his tone brooking no argument. I'm not letting them touch Nellie. If that means fighting 50 enforcers, then that's what I'll do. Essie watched him pace, watched the predator beneath his skin prowl just beneath the surface, and felt something twist in her chest. This was the Clarence she remembered from before the council had corrupted him, before duty had carved away pieces of his humanity. This was the Alpha who'd once stood between her and a rival pack's challenge, who'd taken wounds meant for her, who'd sworn he'd protect her until his last breath. But protection had always come with a price, and Essie was tired of paying it. There's another option, she said quietly, and both Clarence and Thora turned to look at her. I surrender. I turn myself in, claim I coerced you into helping me, that Nellie's location is secret even from me. They'd have no reason to punish you, and I'd buy time for someone to smuggle Nellie out of the kingdom. Absolutely not, Clarence said immediately. It's the only way. It's not an option, Clarence interrupted, crossing the warehouse in 3 strides to grip her shoulders. Essie, listen to me. The moment you surrender, they will kill you. Publicly. Slowly. And then they'll tear this kingdom apart looking for Nellie. Your sacrifice wouldn't save anyone. It would just make the hunt more vicious. He's right, Thora added reluctantly. Quillen doesn't take prisoners. He takes trophies. Essie's hands curled into fists, frustration and fear warring in her chest. Then what do we do? Wait here for them to find us. Let Nellie watch us die trying to protect her. We invoke the right of council intervention, Thora said, pulling a second parchment from her jacket. It's an ancient law, older even than the codes Clarence cited. If an Alpha formally requests council intervention in a blood dispute, the High Court is legally obligated to grant an audience before carrying out any death sentence. It would buy us time. Time for what? Essie demanded. Time for me to present evidence, Clarence said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Time to prove that Nellie's bloodline isn't a threat. That Mavis Whitlam's reforms were sound. That the council's fear is based on propaganda rather than truth. You have evidence? Essie asked, surprised. Clarence hesitated, then nodded. I've been gathering it for 3 months. Documents, testimonies, historical records that prove the council lied about your grandmother's assassination. That they orchestrated it because she threatened their power structure, not because she posed any danger to pack stability. Essie stared at him, her mind reeling. You've been investigating the council, while pretending to be loyal to them. I've been trying to fix what I broke, Clarence said simply. When I stayed silent during your testimony, I made a choice that I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I also made a promise to myself that day, that I would find a way to make things right, even if it cost me everything. The bond between them flared, sudden and overwhelming, and Essie felt 3 months of anger and betrayal crack beneath the weight of that admission. He'd been protecting her in the only way he could, working within a system designed to crush dissent, gathering ammunition to destroy the council from the inside. It didn't erase what he'd done, didn't undo the pain of watching him stand silent while she was condemned. But it meant he'd never stopped fighting for her, even when she'd believed he'd abandoned her entirely. Why didn't you tell me? Essie whispered. Because I couldn't risk the council discovering what I was doing, Clarence said. If they'd suspected I was investigating them, they would have moved against you immediately. The only way to keep you safe was to make them believe I'd chosen them over you. And now they know the truth. Now there's no more pretending. Clarence's grip on her shoulders tightened. So we request council intervention, we present the evidence, and we force them to confront what they've done. It's a long shot, but it's better than dying in this warehouse. Thora cleared her throat. There's one problem with that plan. Council intervention requires the accused to be present at the hearing, which means Essie would have to walk into the council chamber voluntarily, surrounded by the very people who want her dead. No, Clarence said immediately. We'll find another way. But Essie was already shaking her head, already understanding what needed to happen. There is no other way. If we want to save Nellie, if we want to expose the council's corruption, I have to be there. I have to stand before them and make them see what they've done. Essie, I'm not running anymore, Essie said firmly. I'm tired of hiding, tired of being hunted, tired of watching Nellie grow up in fear. If there's even a chance this works, I have to take it. Clarence looked like he wanted to argue, but Nellie stirred in her makeshift bed across the warehouse, her small voice cutting through the tension. Essie, is it morning yet? Not yet, sweetheart, Essie called back, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside her. Go back to sleep. Okay, Nellie murmured, already drifting off again. Essie turned back to Clarence, and this time when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every decision that had led them to this moment. I'll request council intervention. But if anything goes wrong, if they try to execute me before the hearing, you take Nellie and run. You get her out of this kingdom, out of their reach. Promise me. I won't leave you, Clarence said. Promise me, Essie repeated, her tone sharp. Nellie's survival is more important than mine. More important than yours. She's the last link to a bloodline that could change everything for Omegas in this kingdom. If she dies, Mavis's dream dies with her. So promise me, Clarence. Promise me you'll save her, even if it means letting me die. The warehouse fell silent, and Essie watched Clarence wrestle with the promise she was demanding. She could feel his resistance through the bond, feel his desperate need to protect them both, to find a solution that didn't require sacrifice. But they were past the point of perfect solutions, past the point of happy endings. All that remained was choosing which future to fight for, one where they all survived or one where Nellie did. Finally, Clarence nodded. I promise, he said, his voice breaking on the words. If it comes to that, I'll save her. But I'm going to fight like hell to make sure it doesn't come to that. Good, Essie said. And then, because the bond demanded honesty even in the darkest moments, she added, I never stopped loving you. Even when I hated you. Even when I wanted to. I never stopped. Clarence pulled her close, careful not to crush her, and pressed his forehead against hers. I know, he whispered. The bond wouldn't let you, just like it won't let me. We're tied together, Essie. For better or worse, in loyalty or betrayal, until death finally breaks us apart. They stood like that for a long moment, two wolves bound by history and fate and a love that had survived every attempt to destroy it. And when they finally pulled apart, when Thora handed Essie the formal request for council intervention, Essie signed it without hesitation. By dawn, they were on their way to the capital, racing toward a confrontation that would either save them all or end them entirely. The council chamber was exactly as Essie remembered. Cavernous and cold, with stone pillars carved with images of ancient alphas conquering their enemies, with stained glass windows depicting pack victories built on Omega subjugation. The High Court sat on elevated thrones, 7 council members whose combined authority governed every aspect of pack life, and at the center sat the head counselor, an ancient alpha named Jarrah Brennan whose family had held power for 6 generations. Essie stood in the center of the chamber, her wrists bound in silver chains that burned against her skin. Her cloak stripped away to reveal the simple traveling clothes beneath. Nellie had been taken to a separate room. For the child's protection, they'd claimed, though Essie knew it was really to eliminate any leverage she might have during the hearing. Clarence stood beside her, his formal alpha regalia replaced with the plain clothes of an accused traitor, his expression carved from granite. Quillen Malloy stood guard at the chamber entrance, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, his eyes tracking Essie's every movement with predatory focus. He'd made his opinion clear when they'd arrived at the capital, that this hearing was a waste of time, that justice would be better served by executing them in the courtyard and being done with it. But even Quillen couldn't override council intervention once it had been formally invoked. Jara Brennan leaned forward, his ancient eyes assessing Essie with the cold calculation of someone who'd sent thousands to their deaths without losing sleep over it. "Essie Whitlam," he intoned, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You stand accused of treason against pack law, of harboring a forbidden bloodline, and of corrupting an alpha into betraying his oath. How do you plead?" "Not guilty," Essie said clearly. "And I invoke my right to present evidence in my defense." Murmurs rippled through the council, and Jara's expression darkened. "This hearing was granted as a courtesy, not as a trial. The evidence of your crimes is well established." "Then you have nothing to fear from hearing mine," Essie countered. "Unless, of course, the council is afraid of what that evidence might reveal." Jara's eyes narrowed, but he gestured for her to continue. "Very well. Present your evidence. But be warned, any attempt to deceive this court will result in immediate execution." Clarence stepped forward, pulling a leather satchel from his shoulder and laying it on the stone floor between them and the High Court. Inside this satchel are documents recovered from the Royal Archives, testimonies from surviving witnesses to Mavis Whitlam's assassination, and financial records proving that the council paid rogues to carry out the killing. The chamber erupted into chaos, council members shouting denials, guards moving forward with hands on weapons. But Jara raised one hand, and silence fell instantly. "These are serious accusations, Alpha Dunstan," Jara said, his tone dangerous. "I hope for your sake that you can substantiate them." "I can," Clarence said, pulling the first document from the satchel. "This is a letter from Council Member Ferris McClay to Quillen Malloy, dated 3 days before Mavis Whitlam's death. In it, McClay authorizes payment of 10,000 gold pieces to a rogue pack in exchange for eliminating the Omega problem. The letter is signed, sealed, and witnessed by 2 other council members, both of whom are sitting in this chamber right now." He held up the parchment, and even from where Essie stood, she could see the distinctive seal of the High Court stamped at the bottom. Jara's expression remained neutral, but several council members shifted uncomfortably, and Essie felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. "This proves nothing," Quillen interjected from his position by the door. "Forgeries are easy to create. Anyone with access to the archives could have fabricated this. Which is why I brought corroborating evidence," Clarence said, pulling out a second document. "This is a testimony from Nola Carrington, one of the rogues paid to carry out the assassination. She describes in detail how the council approached her pack, how they planned the attack, and how they covered it up afterward by blaming Mavis's reforms for creating instability. Nola is currently being held in protective custody, and she's willing to testify publicly." The council chamber fell silent, and Essie watched as several members exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. But Jara simply leaned back in his throne, his expression unreadable. "Even if this testimony is accurate," Jara said slowly, "it changes nothing. Mavis Whitlam's reforms were dangerous. They undermined pack hierarchy, encouraged Omega rebellion, and created a power vacuum that led to decades of conflict. Her assassination, while regrettable, was necessary to restore order." "Order built on murder," Essie said, her voice cutting through the chamber. "Order maintained by hunting children. Order that demands Omega submission at the cost of our lives, our freedom, our futures. You call that stability? I call it tyranny." "Watch your tongue, Omega," Quillen warned, his hand tightening on his blade. "You're already condemned. Don't make your death more painful than it needs to be." But Essie didn't back down. She'd come too far, sacrificed too much, to let fear silence her now. "Nellie is 3 years old," she said, her voice rising. "She's an innocent child whose only crime is being born to the wrong bloodline. And you want to execute her because you're afraid of what she represents. Proof that Omegas don't need alphas to rule, that we're capable of sovereignty without submission, that your entire hierarchy is built on lies and violence and the systematic erasure of anyone who threatens your power." "Enough," Jara commanded, his voice sharp as a whip crack. "This hearing is concluded. Essie Whitlam, you are found guilty of treason and blood crimes against pack law. Your sentence is death by public execution, to be carried out at sunset. Clarence Dunstan, for your role in aiding a condemned criminal, you are stripped of your alpha title and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. The child will be remanded to council custody and her bloodline will be terminated according to protocol. Guards, remove them." But before the guards could move, before Quillen could draw his blade, the massive doors at the chamber's entrance burst open, and Thora Calwell strode through with an army at her back. They wore the colors of 7 different territories, representatives from every pack in the kingdom, and their faces carried expressions of wolves who'd traveled far to witness justice. At their head walked an elderly Omega woman with silver hair and eyes that blazed with righteous fury, Isla Drummond, the last surviving member of Mavis Whitlam's original council, the Omega who'd helped draft the reforms that the High Court had spent decades trying to erase from history. "This hearing is not concluded," Isla announced, her voice carrying through the chamber with surprising strength. "Not while there are witnesses who remember the truth. Not while there are packs who refuse to accept your corrupted version of pack law." Jara rose from his throne, his face darkening. "Isla Drummond, you were exiled from this kingdom 30 years ago. You have no authority here, no right to interrupt these proceedings." "I have every right," Isla said, moving to stand beside Essie and Clarence. "Because I was there the night Mavis Whitlam was murdered. I watched your enforcers break down the sanctuary doors. I heard her scream as they tore her throat out. And I've spent 30 years gathering testimony from every Omega who survived your purge, every wolf who witnessed your crimes, every pack member brave enough to speak truth to your tyranny." She pulled a thick folder from her satchel and threw it at Jara's feet. Documents scattered across the stone floor, testimonies, photographs, evidence of 3 decades of systematic oppression. "You want to execute Essie Whitlam for protecting a child? Then you'll have to execute every wolf standing behind me. Because we all carry the forbidden bloodline. We're all descendants of Omegas who dared to believe they deserved sovereignty. And we're done hiding." The council chamber erupted into pandemonium. Council members were shouting, guards were moving to block the exits, and Quillen had his blade drawn. His eyes locked on Isla with murderous intent. But the wolves who'd entered with Isla stood their ground, forming a protective wall around Essie, Clarence, and the elderly Omega who'd just declared war on the High Court. Essie felt tears streaming down her face, felt the bond with Clarence surge with something that might have been vindication. They weren't alone. They'd never been alone. For every Omega the council had silenced, there were dozens more waiting for the chance to speak. For every bloodline they'd tried to erase, there were survivors who'd kept the truth alive. "You have no proof," Jara said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "These testimonies are decades old. The witnesses are biased. This evidence wouldn't hold up in any legitimate court." "Then let's test that theory," Isla said, her smile sharp. "Because I've also brought representatives from the High Council of the Western Territories, the governing body that oversees all pack law disputes in this hemisphere. And they're very interested in hearing testimony about a regional council that's been operating outside legal parameters for 3 generations." 3 wolves stepped forward from the group, wearing the formal regalia of the Western High Council, their expressions grave. The tallest, an alpha named Warwick Brennan, ironically sharing Jara's family name but clearly no ally, addressed the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. "Jara Brennan, you and your council are hereby summoned to answer charges of unlawful execution, systematic oppression of Omega populations, falsification of historical records, and conspiracy to commit murder against a sovereign Omega queen. These charges have been filed by 17 different packs across 7 territories, and the evidence is substantial enough to warrant a full investigation." Jara's face had gone ashen. "You can't. This is an internal matter. The Western High Council has no jurisdiction over." "We have jurisdiction over any council that violates the foundational principles of pack law," Warwick interrupted. "And those principles include the right to fair trial, the prohibition against bloodline persecution, and the protection of Omega sovereignty as established in the original pack accords. Your council has violated all three. Repeatedly. 4 generations. This is a coup, Quillen snarled, stepping forward. You're trying to overthrow legitimate authority based on the lies of exiled criminals and treasonous Omegas. No, Essie said, finding her voice again. This is accountability. This is justice. This is what happens when you build an empire on fear and murder. Eventually, the truth catches up to you. She turned to face the High Court, the silver chain still burning against her wrists but her spine straight, her voice steady. My grandmother Mavis Whitlam wasn't a threat to pack stability. She was a threat to your power. She proved that Omegas could lead without Alphas controlling them, that we could create systems based on consent rather than dominance, that pack law could evolve beyond the brutal hierarchy you've spent centuries enforcing. And you killed her for it. You killed her, and then you spent 3 decades hunting down every Omega who remembered her legacy, every child who carried her bloodline, every wolf brave enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way. Her voice rose, carrying to every corner of the chamber. Nellie is 3 years old. She doesn't understand pack politics or bloodline purity or the council's obsession with maintaining control. She's a child who lost her mother, who's been hunted her entire life for the crime of existing. And if you execute her, if you continue this cycle of violence and oppression, then you prove everything my grandmother believed about this council, that you're incapable of mercy, incapable of change, incapable of anything except preserving your own power at the cost of innocent lives. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the council members who'd been shouting earlier had gone quiet, and Essie could see the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of political survival. They'd ruled through fear for so long that they'd forgotten what happened when that fear finally broke. When wolves stopped being afraid of death and started being angry about injustice. Jarrah stood slowly, his age showing in the stiffness of his movements, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its commanding edge. What do you want, Isla? What will it take for you to withdraw these charges? Full accountability, Isla said immediately. Public acknowledgement of Mavis Whitlam's assassination and the council's role in orchestrating it. Restoration of Omega sovereignty rights as outlined in her original reforms. Dissolution of the current High Court and formation of a new governing body with equal representation from all pack designations, Alpha, Beta, and Omega. And immediate pardons for Essie Whitlam, Clarence Dunstan, and Nellie Whitlam, with full restoration of their pack rights and protections. That's impossible, Jarrah said flatly. The packs would never accept Omega representation on the High Court. It would destabilize everything we've built. Everything you've built is already unstable, Thora interjected, stepping forward. I've served as Beta to the Northern Territory for 15 years, and I've watched this council create more problems than it solves. The sanctuary raids didn't eliminate Omega resistance, they radicalized it. The bloodline purges didn't create stability. They created refugees and rogues and wolves who have nothing left to lose. Your system is broken, Jarrah. It's been broken for decades. The only question is whether you're willing to fix it or whether you'd rather watch it collapse entirely. Clarence moved to stand beside Essie, his presence solid and reassuring. The packs are ready for change, he said. I've been speaking with other alphas across the territories, and there's widespread support for Omega sovereignty reform. The younger generation doesn't remember Mavis Whitlam's reign, but they've seen the consequences of the council's policies. The violence, the instability, the waste of potential. They're ready to try something different. And if we refuse? Quillen asked, his hand still on his blade. Then the Western High Council will dissolve this regional authority and impose external governance until a legitimate council can be established, Warwick said. Your packs will lose autonomy. Your territories will be placed under supervision. And every wolf in this kingdom will know that it happened because you valued power more than justice. The council members exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. Essie could see the moment the political calculus shifted, could see them weighing their options and coming to the same conclusion, that they'd finally been outmaneuvered, that their 3 generations of carefully maintained control had crumbled in the space of an hour. But Jara wasn't finished fighting. Even if we agree to these terms, he said slowly, there's still the matter of the child. Essie Whitlam represents a direct challenge to the current power structure. As long as she lives, as long as she carries Mavis's bloodline, there will be wolves who see her as a symbol of rebellion, who'll rally around her and use her as justification for violence. Then stop making her a symbol, Essie said, her voice hard. Stop persecuting bloodlines. Stop teaching wolves that Omega sovereignty is dangerous. Stop perpetuating the same fear-based propaganda that got my grandmother killed. Nellie is a child, not a weapon. The only reason she represents a threat is because you've spent decades convincing everyone that Omega leadership is something to fear. She's right, Isla added. The forbidden bloodline is only forbidden because you declared it so. Mavis's descendants aren't inherently dangerous. They're dangerous to your authority because they represent an alternative. A future where Omegas have power without needing Alpha approval. And that terrifies you. Jara's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked at Essie with something that might have been grudging respect. You're very much like your grandmother, he said quietly. She had that same fire. That same refusal to back down even when facing impossible odds. My grandmother died because of your fear, Essie said. Don't you dare compare us. I'm not comparing, Jara said. I'm acknowledging. Mavis Whitlam was one of the most formidable Omegas I've ever encountered. She terrified me not because she was violent or unstable but because she was right. Her reforms would have worked. They would have created a more equitable system, reduced conflict, given Omegas the dignity and autonomy they deserved. And we killed her for it because we were too afraid to admit that the hierarchy we'd built our entire identity around was fundamentally unjust. The admission hung in the air, and Essie saw several council members flinch at the nakedness of it. Jara had just confessed to 3 decades of systematic oppression, had admitted that Mavis's assassination had been about preserving power rather than maintaining stability. It was more than Essie had ever hoped to hear from the High Court, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Clarence's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers despite the silver chains. The bond between them pulsed with shared grief, shared vindication, shared hope for a future they'd both believed was impossible. So what happens now? Essie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jara looked at his fellow council members, then back at Isla and the assembled wolves. We vote, he said, on whether to accept the terms Isla outlined, on whether to dissolve this council and build something better, on whether we finally acknowledge that the system we've maintained for generations has caused more harm than good. The vote took less than 5 minutes. 4 council members voted in favor of accepting the terms. 2 voted against. 1 abstained. And just like that, 3 generations of Omega oppression began to crumble. Essie felt her knees buckle, felt Clarence catch her before she could fall. The silver chains were removed by a guard who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, and the moment her wrists were free, she was running toward the side chamber where they'd taken Nellie. The toddler was sitting on a bench with a female guard watching over her, playing with a wooden doll someone had given her to keep her occupied. When she saw Essie, her face lit up, and she launched herself across the room with the fearless enthusiasm only children possessed. Essie! Nellie cried, wrapping her arms around Essie's neck. Are the bad men gone? Can we go home now? Essie held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of child and innocence and hope. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered. The bad men are gone. We're safe now. All of us? Nellie asked, pulling back to look at Essie's face. You and me and the Alpha. All of us, Essie confirmed, her throat tight with emotion. Clarence appeared in the doorway, and Nellie reached for him immediately, her small hands making grabbing motions. He crossed the room and pulled them both into his arms, his presence enveloping them, and Essie felt the bond between them settle into something that felt almost like peace. The collapse came 3 days later, when the reality of what they'd accomplished finally caught up with Essie's adrenaline-fueled endurance. They'd been staying in Clarence's northern estate, a sprawling property on the edge of the territory where Nellie could run and play without fear of hunters tracking her movements. The new Provisional Council had granted them full pardons, had restored Clarence's Alpha title, and had begun the process of implementing Omega sovereignty reforms across all 7 territories. Should have felt like victory. It should have felt like the happy ending Essie had stopped believing in 3 months ago. Instead, she woke up in the middle of the night screaming, her body drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of rogues closing and making her heart race. Clarence was beside her immediately, pulling her against his chest, murmuring reassurances that penetrated the panic slowly, like sunlight through fog. "You're safe," he kept saying. "You're home. No one's hunting you anymore." But Essie couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop seeing the alley, the rogues, the moment she'd been certain they were going to die. 3 months of running had carved grooves into her psyche, had taught her that safety was an illusion, that every moment of peace was just the calm before the next attack. And even though her rational mind knew the threat was over, her body hadn't received the message. "I can't," she gasped, her fingers clutching Clarence's shirt. "I can't stop seeing it. The sanctuary burning. Nellie's mother screaming. The rogues in the marketplace. The council chamber. I thought if we just survived long enough, if we just made it through, everything would be okay. But I don't know how to stop surviving. I don't know how to just live." Clarence held her tighter, his own breathing unsteady. "I know," he said. "I know, love. The trauma doesn't just disappear because the threat is gone. It stays in your bones, in your reflexes, in the way you wake up ready to run before you remember you don't have to anymore." "How do I fix it?" Essie whispered. "You don't fix it alone," Clarence said. "You let me help you. You let Thora help you. You let the healers and the counselors and everyone who's fought similar battles help you. And you give yourself time to understand that surviving was the hardest thing you've ever done, and learning to live again is going to take just as much courage." Essie pulled back to look at him, saw the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the signs that he was carrying his own trauma from these 3 months. "You're not okay either," she observed. "No," Clarence admitted. "I'm not. I watched you run. I stayed silent while they condemned you. I spent 3 months believing I'd made the choice that would keep you alive and terrified I'd actually just made the choice that would get you killed. I'm not okay, Essie. But I'm here. And we're going to figure out how to be okay together." They sat like that for a long time, 2 wolves bound by love and trauma and the stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. And when Nellie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes and asking if everything was all right, they made room for her between them, creating a nest of safety for the child who'd been the catalyst for everything. "Tell me a story," Nellie requested, snuggling against Essie's side. "About Grandma Mavis. About when Omegas were queens." Essie looked at Clarence, saw him nod encouragingly, and began to speak. She told Nellie about Mavis Whitlam, about the Omega Queen who'd refused to bow, who'd rewritten pack law to protect the vulnerable, who'd believed that strength came in many forms and that leadership didn't require dominance. She told her about the sanctuaries, about the reforms, about the dream of a world where wolves could exist without hierarchy dictating their worth. And as she spoke, as Nellie's breathing evened out into sleep, Essie felt something shift inside her. The trauma was still there. The fear was still there. But beneath it, growing stronger with every word, was the understanding that Mavis's dream hadn't died with her. It had survived in Isla's testimony, in the 17 packs who'd stood with them, in Nellie's existence, in Essie's refusal to stop fighting. "We're going to change everything," Essie said quietly, looking at Clarence over Nellie's sleeping form. "Aren't we?" "Yes," Clarence said. "We are. Together." The bond between them pulsed with certainty, with love, with the promise of a future they'd fought impossible odds to create. And for the first time in 3 months, Essie let herself believe it was real. The Provisional Council's first major reform came 2 weeks later, the official restoration of Omega sovereignty rights and the establishment of Omega representation on the High Court. Isla Drummond was appointed as the first Omega counselor in 3 generations, and she wasted no time implementing changes. Sanctuaries were reopened. Bloodline persecution was formally outlawed. Forced bonding was made illegal, with strict penalties for alphas who violated Omega consent. But the most significant change came in the form of education reform. The Council authorized the creation of new historical records, ones that included Mavis Whitlam's actual achievements rather than the propaganda that had painted her as a threat. Omega children would learn that their ancestors had been queens, healers, leaders, warriors. They would learn that submission was a choice, not an obligation. They would learn that their worth wasn't determined by an alpha's approval. Essie was asked to lead the education initiative, and she accepted despite her lingering trauma, despite the nightmares that still woke her most nights, despite the part of her that wanted to hide in Clarence's estate and never face the world again. Because Nellie was watching. Because Mavis's legacy demanded it. Because if she didn't use her survival for something meaningful, then what had been the point of fighting so hard to live? The first school opened in the Northern Territory, in a building that had once been a rogue den and was now transformed into a bright, welcoming space where Omega children could learn without fear. Essie stood at the front of the classroom on opening day, looking at the 24 young faces staring back at her, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "My name is Essie Whitlam," she began, "and I'm here to tell you about your grandmother, about your history, about the Omegas who came before you and fought for the rights you're going to inherit. This isn't going to be an easy lesson. Some of you have heard lies about Omega weakness, about the need for alpha protection, about bloodlines being dangerous or forbidden. I'm going to tell you the truth instead. And the truth is this: you are descended from queens." She taught them about Mavis. She taught them about the reforms, the assassinations, the decades of systematic oppression. She taught them about Nellie, about the little girl who'd been hunted for the crime of existing, who now played safely in Clarence's garden while political structures crumbled and rebuilt themselves around her innocence. And she taught them about resistance, about the importance of standing up even when the world tried to push you down, about the power of refusing to accept injustice just because it was traditional, about the courage it took to be the first, to be the loudest, to be the one who said no more when everyone else stayed silent. The students listened with the intensity of children who'd been starved for stories about themselves, who'd never seen Omegas portrayed as anything except submissive, fragile, in need of protection. And when Essie finished her first lesson, when she asked if there were questions, every hand in the classroom shot up. She answered them all. She stayed late, long after the scheduled class time ended, because these children deserved honesty. They deserved to know what had been stolen from them and what they were going to build in its place. And when she finally left the building, exhausted but lighter than she'd felt in months, Clarence was waiting outside with Nellie riding on his shoulders. "How did it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "Good," Essie said, surprised by how true it felt. "Really good. They're hungry for this, Clarence. For the truth. For permission to be proud of who they are. Just like their teacher," Clarence observed, smiling. Essie felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't deny it. The past 3 months had been about survival, about keeping Nellie alive, about fighting a system designed to crush them. But now it was about building something better. About using the platform they'd been forced to create and turning it into lasting change. "Isla wants me to speak at the Western High Council Assembly next month," Essie said, "to present testimony about the bloodline persecution and recommend policy changes for other territories. Are you going to do it?" Clarence asked. Essie thought about it, thought about standing in front of the most powerful wolves in the hemisphere and telling them they'd been complicit in oppression. Thought about the fear, the vulnerability, the risk of painting a target on her back all over again. But she also thought about the students, about their eager faces, about the future they deserved. "Yes," she said firmly. "I am." Clarence's smile widened, and he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Then I'm coming with you. As your mate, your alpha, and your most enthusiastic supporter." "Mate," Essie repeated, tasting the word. "We never actually completed the bonding ritual, you know. The tribunal was interrupted." "True," Clarence acknowledged. "Would you like to?" Essie stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Nellie had fallen asleep on his shoulders, Her small body relaxed in complete trust, and the evening sun painted everything golden. This man, this alpha who'd tracked her tears, who'd defied his counsel, who'd spent 3 months gathering evidence while pretending loyalty, was asking if she wanted to formally bond with him, to make permanent what the crisis had already forged between them. "Yes," Essie said, her voice steady. "But on our terms. Not the council's terms, not pack law's terms. Terms. Equal partnership, shared authority, mutual respect. No dominance, no submission. Just us, choosing each other every day." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Clarence said. And then, because Nellie was asleep and couldn't interrupt, he kissed her. It was gentle and fierce and tasted like hope, like a future they'd fought impossible odds to claim, like the beginning of something that might actually last. When they pulled apart, Essie noticed Thora watching from across the street, her expression approving. Other wolves were watching too. Some with curiosity, some with judgment, but most with something that looked like relief. Like they'd been waiting for proof that love could survive political upheaval, that bonds could strengthen under pressure rather than shatter. "Let them watch," Essie said quietly. "Let them see what's possible." "New beginnings," Clarence agreed. "For all of us." They walked home together, the bonded alpha and his omega mate, the forbidden child sleeping safely on his shoulders, and behind them, the foundation of a new world was already taking shape. The Western High Council Assembly took place in a massive amphitheater designed to hold thousands of wolves from across the hemisphere. Essie stood backstage, her hands shaking despite the beta-calming tea Thora had forced her to drink, and tried to remember why she'd agreed to this. The amphitheater was already 3/4 full, with alphas and their entourages taking up the prime seating while omegas and betas clustered in the back. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Even in a space designed for reform, hierarchy still dictated where you sat. "You don't have to do this," Clarence said, appearing at her side. "If it's too much, we can." "No," Essie interrupted. "I do have to do this. Because if I don't, if I let fear keep me silent, then nothing changes. The council reforms our regional territory, but the rest of the hemisphere continues operating under the same broken system. Have to speak. I have to make them understand what the bloodline persecution cost, what it's still costing in territories where omegas are still being hunted." Isla appeared on her other side, resplendent in formal council robes that marked her new status. "The Western High Council is ready for you," she said. "Remember, you're not just telling your story. You're telling the story of every Omega who couldn't speak, who didn't survive, who's still hiding because they're afraid of what will happen if they're discovered. You're their voice now, Essie. Use it well." The weight of that responsibility should have crushed her. Instead, it straightened her spine, steadied her breathing, reminded her that she'd survived 3 months of being hunted. She could survive 20 minutes of public testimony. Essie walked onto the stage, and the amphitheater fell silent. Thousands of eyes tracked her movement, assessing, judging, waiting to see if the Omega who'd defied an entire council would be worth the disruption she'd caused. She took her position at the speaking podium, adjusted the amplification crystal that would carry her voice to every corner of the massive space, and began. "My name is Essie Whitlam," she said, her voice steady. "I am the granddaughter of Mavis Whitlam, the Omega Queen who was assassinated 30 years ago for the crime of believing Omegas deserved sovereignty. I stand before you today not as a victim, not as a criminal, not as someone asking for mercy or forgiveness. I stand before you as living proof that the bloodline persecution system is built on fear, propaganda, and the systematic erasure of Omega autonomy." She told them everything. About growing up hearing whispered stories of her grandmother, about the sanctuary raids, about pulling Nellie from the rubble of a building the council had burned, about 3 months of running, of hiding, of watching a 3-year-old child grow up believing she was inherently wrong, inherently dangerous, inherently deserving of death. About the rogues in the alley, about Clarence tracking her tears, about standing in the council chamber and being condemned for the crime of protecting an innocent. And then she told them about the evidence. About the letters proving the council had paid for Mavis's assassination. About the testimonies from survivors who'd watched Omega leaders be systematically eliminated. About the financial records showing how much gold had been spent maintaining a system designed to keep Omegas powerless. "The question before you today," Essie said, her voice rising to carry across the amphitheater, "is whether you're going to continue perpetuating this system. Whether you're going to keep teaching young Omegas that their worth is determined by alpha approval. Whether you're going to keep declaring bloodlines forbidden because you're afraid of what Omega sovereignty might mean for your power structure. Or whether you're going to acknowledge that the hierarchy you've built is fundamentally unjust, and commit to doing better." The silence that followed was deafening. Essie could see council members exchanging glances, could see alphas shifting uncomfortably in their seats, could see Omegas in the back rows sitting straighter, their expressions transforming from resignation to hope. And then someone started clapping. A single Omega in the back row, standing up, her applause echoing through the amphitheater. Another Omega joined her. Then another. Within seconds, half the amphitheater was on their feet, applauding with the fierce enthusiasm of wolves who'd been waiting their entire lives to hear someone say what Essie had just articulated. The other half remained seated, their expressions ranging from skeptical to hostile. But they were listening. And that, Essie realized, was the beginning of change. Not universal acceptance, but the crack in the foundation that would let new structures take root. The head of the Western High Council, an ancient alpha named Warwick who'd helped investigate her regional council, stood and raised his hand for silence. "Essie Whitlam," he said formally. "Your testimony has been heard and will be entered into the official record. The Western High Council will now deliberate on whether to recommend Omega sovereignty reforms across all territories under our jurisdiction. You have our gratitude for your courage in speaking truth to power." It wasn't a guarantee of change. It wasn't even a promise to try. But it was acknowledgement, and in the political landscape of pack hierarchy, acknowledgement was revolutionary. Essie left the stage to thunderous applause from half the amphitheater and stony silence from the other half. Clarence was waiting in the wings, his expression proud, and he pulled her into his arms the moment she was clear of the public eye. "You did it," he murmured against her hair. "You absolute warrior. You did it." "We did it," Essie corrected. "All of us. Everyone who refused to stay silent. Everyone who kept Mavis's dream alive even when it seemed impossible." But as they left the amphitheater, as they made their way through crowds of wolves offering congratulations or dark looks depending on their political leanings, Essie felt a familiar sensation crawl up her spine. The feeling of being watched, of being tracked, of being hunted. She turned, scanning the crowd, and caught a glimpse of a scarred face disappearing into the masses. Not one of the rogues from the alley. They were both dead. Someone else. Someone new. Someone whose expression promised that just because one battle had been won didn't mean the war was over. "Clarence," she said quietly, her hand finding his. "We need to get Nellie somewhere secure. Now." He didn't question her instincts, didn't ask for proof. They'd learned that lesson the hard way 3 months ago. Instead, he whistled sharply, and Thora appeared with a contingent of guards, their expressions alert. "Threat assessment," Thora asked curtly. "Unknown," Essie admitted. "But my wolf is screaming that something's wrong. That we're not as safe as we thought." "Then we move," Thora said, already coordinating with her team through subtle hand signals. "Back to the northern estate, full security protocol. No one in or out without clearance." They left the amphitheater through a side exit, moving quickly but not so quickly as to cause panic. But Essie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that someone was tracking their movements with predatory precision, that the victory they just celebrated was about to be tested in ways they couldn't anticipate. Because the council might have reformed. The Western High Council might be considering policy changes. But there were still wolves in this world who believed Omega sovereignty was a threat, who'd profited from the old system, who had everything to lose if the hierarchy truly collapsed. And those wolves weren't going to give up power without a fight. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn, when the estate's defenses were at their weakest point during shift change. Essie woke to the sound of shattering glass and Thora's shouted warning, and she was moving before her conscious mind had fully processed the threat. She grabbed Nellie from the bed, wrapped her in the closest blanket, and ran. Clarence shifted immediately, his massive wolf form blocking the bedroom door as rogues poured into the hallway. These weren't opportunistic hunters looking for bounty money. These were trained enforcers, coordinated and deadly, wearing the colors of at least 3 different territories that hadn't supported the reforms. "The window," Thora barked, appearing in wolf form to fight alongside Clarence. "Go now." Essie didn't argue. She climbed through the bedroom window with Nellie clutched against her chest, dropped 8 feet to the manicured lawn below, and ran. Behind her, the sounds of combat were deafening, snarls and howls and the wet crack of bones breaking. She wanted to stop, wanted to help, wanted to fight beside her mate. But Nellie was her priority. Nellie had always been her priority. She made it to the tree line before someone tackled her from behind. Essie rolled with the impact, protecting Nellie with her body, and came up fighting. Her attacker was a massive beta male with the council's old enforcer insignia tattooed on his shoulder, and his eyes held the zealous conviction of someone who believed he was fighting for a righteous cause. "The forbidden bloodline ends tonight," he snarled, reaching for Nellie. Essie shifted, her wolf form smaller than his but faster, and she tore into him with the savage desperation of someone protecting their young. Claws met flesh, teeth found throat, and she didn't stop until he stopped moving, until the threat was neutralized, until Nellie's crying brought her back to humanity. She shifted back, bloody and shaking, and gathered Nellie into her arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the terrified toddler. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. But I need you to be brave a little longer, okay? Can you be brave for me?" Nellie nodded, her face streaked with tears, and Essie kissed her forehead before standing. She could hear more fighting coming from the estate, could feel the bond with Clarence pulsing with pain and fury, and she knew she had to make a choice. Hide Nellie and return to help, or keep running and pray Clarence could hold his own. But the choice was made for her when Clarence appeared through the trees, bloodied but alive, with Thora and a dozen loyal guards flanking him. The attack had been repelled, but the cost was written across his face. 3 guards dead, 5 wounded, and the realization that their victory at the Western High Council had made them targets for every wolf who opposed reform. "They'll keep coming," Clarence said, his voice rough. "As long as Nellie represents the forbidden bloodline, as long as she's a symbol of what could be, there will be wolves willing to kill her to preserve the old ways." "Then we make her more than a symbol," Essie said, an idea crystallizing in her mind. "We make her education public. We show the world that she's just a child, that the forbidden bloodline isn't a weapon or a threat. We take away their justification for hunting her by proving there's nothing to fear." Isla, who'd arrived with reinforcements, stepped forward. A public presentation, showing Nellie's daily life, her education, her normalcy. It would be risky, but it might work. Hard to demonize a 3-year-old once people see her playing with dolls and asking for bedtime stories. "It's a gamble," Thora warned. "But doing nothing is also a gamble. At least this way, we control the narrative." Clarence looked at Essie, the bond between them humming with shared understanding. They'd survived the impossible once. They could do it again. Together. "We do it," he said. "We show them that the future we're building isn't something to fear. And we dare them to look a child in the eyes and still call her forbidden." The dawn broke over the estate, painting blood and hope in equal measure across the grounds. And as Essie held Nellie close, as Clarence stood guard beside them, as their allies gathered to plan their next move, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The battle for Omega sovereignty wasn't over. But they'd already won the only fight that mattered. The fight to survive, to resist, to refuse to let fear dictate their future. And that was just the beginning. 3 months later, Nellie stood on a stage before gathered packs from across the territories, not as a symbol or a weapon, but as exactly what she was. A little girl who loved stories about her great-grandmother, who wanted to be a healer like Essie, who represented nothing more dangerous than hope. The forbidden bloodline had become the foundation of a new world. And Essie Whitlam, granddaughter of queens, mate to an alpha who'd chosen love over duty, protector of the future. She watched it all unfold and knew that Mavis would be proud. The Omega had hidden the Toddler beneath her cloak as rogues closed in. The Alpha had tracked her tears through impossible distances. And together, they'd rewritten the ending that everyone said was inevitable. Sometimes survival isn't just about staying alive. Sometimes it's about staying human enough to